Well, good evening, everyone. Good to see everyone this evening. Got a good crowd here tonight. Tonight we're going to be finishing up chapter 2 in our study of Christian evidences. We'll look at the review, and then if we have time, we'll get into an introduction to chapter 3, but we won't really get into the meat of that chapter until next Wednesday night. But before we get started with our study, I'm going to ask Jadon if he would to lead us in a word of prayer before we start our class tonight.
Most loving and gracious Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this time you've given us together and study another portion of thy word. Lord, I ask that you give Josh to have a ready recollection of what he's supposed to tell us about, and to help us to better understand ways to spread your gospel to humanity. Be ready at always to defend it and fight for it. Have reason to answer the questions. Lord, we're aware that several have lost loved ones and some are sick and not doing very well. We ask that you be with those that are not here tonight. We pray, Lord, that you be with them. We pray for those who have lost loved ones, that you will comfort them as only you can. Lord, we ask that you watch over us and help us to always center our thoughts and our heart on you. And may we grow closer to Christ in everything we say and do. And may we strive to have a heart like Jesus had. Lord, we ask that you forgive us for our many sins. Go with us in this day. When it comes our time, pray, Lord, we have a home in heaven free. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen. Well, you may remember here in chapter 2, we've been talking about this big word, the cosmological argument. Or, as the authors of our study manual have termed it, the cause and effect argument. We've talked about several different nuances of this, several different aspects of this argument. But as we bring all of this together and kind of come down into a summary of what we've seen in this chapter, ultimately what it comes down to is this. Everything that humans know to exist can be classified as either matter or mind. Now, I'm going to share some things here, and then we'll go back and we'll kind of break this down a little bit, and I'll try to kind of bring this down to a more understandable level as we go along. And so the argument is this. Everything that exists has to be either matter or mind. It has to either have a physical substance or it has to be something that exists within the mind, something that we intend to do, or it's an idea, or it's a theory that we are considering. Everything that exists is either in a hard form, a hard matter form, or it is still, as we would say, in the planning stages. But the argument also says if something exists now, that something eternal must exist. And this is going back to what we've seen with this cause and effect. And ultimately the argument is if there is something that exists, that is the effect of a cause. Something had to happen to cause this effect. Well, as you go back far enough, you have to reach the point logically where you say, well, there is no effect at this stage. There is only cause. And so we have to make the argument, well then, that is the logical beginning of all things. And this cosmological argument states, well, that original prime mover, prime decision maker is God. So therefore, either matter or mind is eternal. So with that in mind, notice it says either matter or mind is eternal. Matter is not eternal. You know, we talked quite at length, and I shared several quotations with you from some eminent scientists in this area. Science has proven that the universe is not eternal. Science has proven that this universe had a beginning at some point. But where the disagreement often lies is, well, what was that beginning? How did the universe come into existence? Of course, those who believe in God, they say that it was created when God said, "Let there be light." And that began those acts of creation. But then those who deny the existence of God, they have a harder time. And so they've come up with all of these different arguments that are out there, everything from the most prominent being the Big Bang Theory, which states that matter was out there, which that's kind of a slippery slope whenever we look at the fact that shows us that matter is not eternal. So my question would be, where did that original matter that was floating around out there, where did it originate? But what they claim, they say that all these particles, all of this matter that we now know as this universe, at one point was just floating around out there in a nothingness. And an explosion took place that fused everything together into the universe that we know today. And I asked you the question before in a previous lesson. Have you ever known an explosion to actually create something? What is the purpose of an explosion? It's to destroy something, to tear something apart. And you know, one argument that's often made, it says, if you cause an explosion to go off in a print shop, is it going to produce a book? Well, the obvious answer to that is no. That's not going to happen whatsoever. But again, that's another argument that we can make. You know, where did this original matter come from that had to be fused together in this Big Bang? Well, science has proven that no matter is eternal. That it had to have a beginning somewhere. Well, that's where the mind comes into play. Now, in this, we need to understand that there is a differentiation between the mind of man and the mind of God. How many of you have heard the old argument or the old statement, mind over matter? Well, ultimately, what that is stating is that the human mind is so strong, is so influential, has so much control over the matter of the body that the mind can actually cause you to disregard certain things, can cause you to overlook certain pains, can cause you to overlook certain emotions, to channel things in certain ways. The mind has the ability to do that. You know, one of the examples that I saw when I was looking at this, it was talking about how, you know, we've probably all seen, I don't figure there's anybody here that's ever attempted this, at least I hope not, but we've probably all seen videos of those who have taken off their shoes and socks and they're walking across hot coals. How are they able to do that? It's because they have trained their minds to shut out the pain. And some of the other arguments, you know, we see these examples like of circus performers and things of that nature that perform these feats that we look at and we just shake our heads. We say, you know, that's got to hurt. Have you ever said that to yourself? You know, that's got to hurt. Yeah, it does hurt. But they've learned how to use the power of the mind to shut off those triggers, to shut off those aspects. But, you know, there's some other areas that we can look at with that. Let's think about it from the standpoint of the medical field. Have you ever heard of something known as the placebo effect? Well, with the placebo effect, it's this whole mentality that, well, I'm taking this pill and it's going to heal me of my illness. Well, oftentimes when new medications are being tested, you'll have a field of study half of those individuals will be given the actual medication. Half of those individuals will be given something like a sugar pill or something that has no medicinal effect whatsoever. Well, guess what? Just about every time, some of those who are receiving that placebo actually will report that they've had some type of improvement in their health. Why? Because their mind has led them to believe. Either their mind has led them to believe they're sick. Yes, that happens. Hypochondria is an illness. Or it leads them to believe, yes, I'm taking a pill, it's going to make me better. The mind is very powerful. And we see this with the human mind. The human mind has been proven to be powerful in many ways, even over the flesh. But now let's take this a step back even further. What about the mind of God? The mind of God. You know, if the human mind has the ability to control matter, the mind of God has the ability to create matter. Well, keep that in mind as we go along. Everything that exists is either dependent or contingent, or it is independent or non-contingent. The argument goes on, if the universe is not eternal, well, we've already determined that it is not. Well, then it is dependent, meaning something or someone had to create the universe. It didn't just come about on its own. The universe is not eternal, therefore it is dependent. But look at this next statement that I've got up here. And this is from your book, but I've gone in and I've kind of elaborated on this just a little bit. It says, if the matter of the universe is dependent, it must have been caused by the mind of something or someone independent. Well, we've talked about this concept of dependence and independence. God is the only one that really fits this description of being independent. We think about all of this creation. Can we look at anything and say that it is truly independent? So we trace it back. If the matter of the universe is dependent, then it has to come from the mind of something that is independent. Well, what does the Old Testament tell us? That God's ways are not our ways. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. What this is showing us is that the mind of God is more powerful than the mind of man. The mind of God is powerful enough to create this universe. We've probably all heard preachers in the past, some of us may have even made the statement before, that this world originated in the mind of God. That God was the one that determined that this world was going to come into existence, and He created it in the way that He wanted it created. He set it into motion. We talked about that the last time that we had class, that God has set things into motion and that it has continued to function in the way that He established from that point. Why? Because this universe is dependent. It's dependent upon something greater, something stronger, something independent. Only God fits that description. Let me share some quotes with you. A gentleman by the name of Sir John Eccles. He's passed away now, but he was a neurophysiologist. He was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, but he wrote this book. It's called The Self and Its Brain. And this book is dealing with this concept that the mind is more than physical matter. That the mind is more than just a physical aspect of the human body. Because the human mind, as he determines in this book, the human mind can have power over the physical aspects of the body. He determined that the brain may be fired simply by intention. We intend to do something, and so we tell our brain that that's what we want to do, and so the brain then sends out those signals to whatever part of the body is necessary to carry that out. You know, I used the example a few weeks back of if I reach down and I pick up a baseball and I toss it to Elton. Well, let's use that example again. If I think I'm going to toss a baseball to Elton, it starts out just a thought. That is my intention. That's what I'm going to do. But my brain then has to fire. It has to signal to my back to bend over, to my arm to reach down, to my hand to pick up the ball. You know, we see all of these things. That communication has to take place. But where did it all originate? With the mind. With thought. Well, that's what he determined. But one of the arguments that he made, and to be perfectly honest, I think there's some that are stronger than this, but we'll flesh this out just a little bit. It says the mind is to the brain what a librarian is to a library. And basically what that is stating, you know, if you go down here to the Randolph County Library, and I know I've done this before, I might walk around for an hour trying to find something and not be able to find it. But then as soon as I walk up to the desk and I ask one of the ladies there, you know, where can I find such and such book? They can take me right to it. That's the argument that's making. You know, the body does not know how to function without those signals from the mind. And anyone that has ever witnessed or has ever dealt with anyone that has battled things such as dementia or Alzheimer's or traumatic brain injuries, things of that nature, you understand that fact. Or you look at those who deal with illnesses such as, say, Lou Gehrig's disease that affects the nervous system. And people completely lose that ability of their mind to communicate to the rest of their body. And so we come to a better comprehension of what this is saying. You know, the mind is there. It's telling your hands, you know, I want to pick this up. But then the body's not responding to it. But what Eccles is using is this argument. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact, he says, the former, meaning the librarian, is not reducible to the latter. A better way of looking at this, the worker doesn't become the work. And so when we look at this from the standpoint of what we've been saying in regard to mind and matter, matter cannot become the mind. And neither can the mind become matter. They are independent of each other, but in the same way, they are dependent upon each other. If you don't have the two of them working together, then they are not going to function in the way that they should. But it's this idea of cause and effect. You know, the effect never becomes the cause. The effect is never greater than the cause. And going back to the example that I shared with you about walking around the library, were any of those resources doing me any good by just wandering around lost for an hour? Were they doing me any good whatsoever? No. But it was only when I found what I needed. When I went to, for lack of better terminology, the higher power, the one with the knowledge, the one with the direction, that's when I received what I needed. So this is what we see with this cause and effect argument. But also in this, he says the thought or the intent. Remember in talking about the example with the baseball, it started out as just a thought. Yeah, I'm going to pick this ball up and I'm going to toss it to Elton. But the thought or the intent never takes the place of the physical brain. Just because we think it doesn't mean that we can control the rest of the body. Now, there are many scientists out there today that are doing a lot of research with electronics and things of that nature, trying to find a way, especially those with disabilities, traumatic brain injuries, things of that nature, that they can kind of tap into the power of the mind and find some way of bypassing these signals so that they can come up with a different way to control these areas. They've not been able to do it. In some ways, yes. In some ways, we think about all of the different electronic devices and things of that nature that control the heart and various other areas of the body. We see people that due to stimulation of certain nerves and things of that nature, it restores function. But if you take away that which is artificial and you go back just to the mind and the matter, is it actually healing the problem? And what I'm saying is, without something man-made, without something that came from the mind of man, something artificial, is that healing able to take place in that way? Well, of course not. And so, at least not at this stage. There may reach a point where technology advances to the point that we may have to change our argument in that way. But if technology does advance to that point, we could very easily make the argument that God is the one that has given man the knowledge, the expertise, and the degree of understanding to be able to bring that about. But the intent, just being able to think it, and that's really the area of study that these scientists are looking at. Can we take this thought, and if the brain has lost its ability to communicate that thought into action, is there some way that we can come in artificially and convert that thought into action? Well, at this point, no. Because like I said, the mind and the matter, they're dependent upon each other, but they function independently of each other. And really what it all boils down to is this: the Creator does not become the created. Who was it that set up the library? It was the librarian. Who was it that devised the idea of casting the ball to Elton? It was the mind. The Creator does not become the created. It remains in a position separate and apart. And then lastly, I want to share this quote with you before we get into our review. This is from Norman Geisler. Norman Geisler was a very well-known theologian and philosopher, passed away just a couple of years ago. But he made this argument. He said, "The cause cannot give what it does not have to give. In my mind or ability to know, or if my mind or ability to know is received, then there must be a mind or a knower who gave it to me. The intellectual does not arise from the non-intellectual. Something cannot arise from nothing." And I think that very well sums up the argument that we've seen in this chapter. That there has to be this greater power. There has to be this supreme entity there that provides the ability, that provides the knowledge. Okay, let's look at our review just real quick. We start out with true or false. And like we did last time, y'all feel free to call out the answers. True or false? God can exist and not exist at the same time. I hope nobody said true. I didn't hear anybody answer, so. No, it is false. The universe does exist and is real. Yes, that is true. Something that cannot create itself is called contingent. That is true. It is dependent upon someone or something else for its existence. True or false? Science has verified that the universe had a beginning. That is true. Next, some material things do not have a cause. True or false? That is false. That is false. All matter has a beginning. Next, true or false? The universe created itself from nothing. That is false. False. Next, the cause is always greater than the effect. The cause is always greater than the effect. That's true. That is true. The cause is always greater than the effect. Next, matter and mind are the same thing. I sure hope after our discussion tonight you don't think that's the case. false. Mind and matter are two different things. Okay, then we have multiple choice. Which of the following terms applies to the universe? Eternal, self-creating, dependent, or independent? Which of the following terms applies to the universe? That would be dependent. C, dependent. Next, every material thing must have a cause described by which of the following phrases? Greater than self, less than self, equal to self, or none of these. That would be the first one. Greater than self. Greater than self. Everything that exists falls into which two categories below? Matter, particle, animal, or mind? There you go. Matter and mind. A and D. Matter and mind. We talked about that tonight. Okay. Which ancient group of rocks? We didn't talk about this in class, but if you read your materials, you'll know this. Which ancient group of rocks was used for astronomical predictions? Was it the Great Barrier Reef, the Statue of Liberty, Stonehenge, or Rock City? Stonehenge. That would be Stonehenge. All right. If a material thing exists, then it must have had which of the two following? Effect, cause, beginning, or car engine? Well, it's cause and effect, yes. Cause and effect. All right, fill in the blanks. The blank exists and is blank. The first would be the universe exists and is real. The universe exists and is real. Next, either God blank exists or he does not blank. There is no blank ground. So first off, either God what? Either God does exist or he does not exist. There is no middle ground. Next, if the universe did not blank itself, it must have a blank. If the universe did not what? Create itself, it must have a creator. Next, the first law of blank states that matter and blank can neither be blank nor destroyed in nature. The first law of thermodynamics states that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed in nature. Next, the blank did not create itself. Such an idea is blank, both philosophically and blank. So, the blank, the what? Did not create itself. The universe did not create itself. Such an idea is absurd, both philosophically and scientifically. All right, then we have matching. We have a case that cannot be refuted is G, a prima facie case. Number 2, the law of cause and effect is also known as E, the cosmological argument. Number 3, had a beginning, will have an end is A, the universe. Number 4, the law of conservation and energy is also known as the first law of thermodynamics. Number 5, cannot create itself is B, matter. Number 6, must come before or at the same time as the effect is cause. Number 7, things are running down, wearing out is H, the second law of thermodynamics. And then lastly, 8, the only thing that can be eternal is the mind. The mind. Okay, now that brings us into chapter 3. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but hopefully we can at least get a little bit of an introduction started tonight. Chapter 3 continues this same general idea of the existence of God, but what we're going to see in chapter 3 is a second type of argument. And this argument is what is known as the design argument. The design argument. But if you notice in your materials, the writer starts out by talking about the law of rationality. You know, in our society today, we often hear people talk about things that are rational. Does that seem rational? Is that something that seems logical? Is that something that makes sense to us? I think that's a better way of putting it. It's the law of sense. Well, the law of rationality means that we accept as true only those conclusions for which there is adequate evidence. You know, that makes sense, doesn't it? That's logical. If there's sufficient evidence there, believe it. Accept it. It's got to be true if the evidence is there to support it. And that's this law of rationality. But why should Christians use this law of rationality? Well, first off, because it's logical. It makes clear sense. But also it's based upon factual evidence. It's not something that's based upon a theory or an opinion. It's something that's based upon hard evidence. But also because it presents arguments that are adequate. And what that means is that when we consider the subject, we have sufficient evidence that is there to pose an adequate solution, to give an adequate answer for what is being considered. But what we're going to be looking at in this third chapter, the second chapter we talked about the cosmological argument, or the argument of cause and effect. Well, in the third chapter, we're going to be talking about another big word, the teleological argument. The teleological argument is also known as the design argument. And what it states, it says that there is evidence of design in the universe which suggests a designer. The first person to really develop this into a strong theological argument was a man by the name of William Paley. William Paley was an Anglican priest who later in his life began to be influenced by John and Charles Wesley there in England, and later in life became a Methodist minister. But he was the first to make a strong use of this argument in matters of religion. He wrote this book, and it's probably too small for you to read the title, but it's called Natural Theology on Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearances of Nature. Sounds like an interesting book, doesn't it? Sounds like it would be a New York Times bestseller if it came out today. But in his day, folks, this was groundbreaking. His argument, based upon logic, clear reasoning, it resonated so well with the people of the day. You know, he was living during the age of enlightenment. People were basing things upon their knowledge and the things that they could study and observe and grasp. Well, Paley came along. And from his book, here is an argument that he makes. He says, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and I asked how the stone came to be there. Now, how'd that rock get there? I might possibly answer that for anything that I knew to the contrary, it had been there forever. Nor would it be very easy to show the absurdity of the answer. But suppose I found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had given before that for anything I knew, the watch might always have been there. If the rock's always been there, then the watch may have always been there. Yet, why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Because every contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater and more, and that in a degree which exceeds computation. So what he's saying, he says, whenever you are able to look at an object, be it something in nature, something as small as a stone on the ground, or whether you pick up a watch. Now you have to remember, in those days, a watch was a very complex piece of work. It had so many different moving parts to it. And to take the back off of that and to watch all of those gears and all those little moving parts was truly an amazing thing to watch. And so what Paley is saying, he says, whether I'm looking at this rock that's lying on the ground or whether I'm looking at this stone, I see design. Someone had to design those things. That rock has not been there forever. Someone had to design that. This watch has not been there forever. Someone had to design that. So breaking this down, he argued that nature must have a designer. And he was most well known for this analogy of the watch. The watch and the watchmaker argument. If there's a watch, then there must be a watchmaker. If you found a watch, you would see that it is a complex, and you would see that it's complex and conclude that an intelligent being, someone smart, had to create that. An intelligent being, a watchmaker, had designed it for the purpose of telling the time. But then he noted that many things in nature were just as complex as the watch. And so there had to be an intelligent designer of those things as well. Now that's where we're going to stop for tonight, because that's really bringing us up to these initial arguments that we're going to see getting into this teleological argument. So we're going to stop right there, and Lord willing, next Wednesday night we'll pick back up at this place.